Well, for those of you who are looking for something to drive that's relatively inexpensive and also fun, classic cars, or let's say near classic cars as well, can be great choices, frankly, because a number of them can be had for reasonable prices. They can be reliable, they drive great, and you could drive something that's far more stylish than a new vehicle. The only caveat I would say is that you really don't want to drive, particularly the vehicles from, let's say, before the 1990s in the salt, because if you do that, just plan on the car looking a little bit less great than it did when you bought it after a couple years probably. But nonetheless, if you're looking for a fair weather daily driver, or even if you have to put one into service on a daily basis, I daily drove a 76 Eldorado for a number of years, and it was a great car. When I bought it, it didn't look that great. It had some rust. And after 3 years of daily driving it, it had a bit more rust, but it didn't cost me anything. So let's go through a list of some vehicles that might make some great daily drivers if you want something other than the norm, particularly given how expensive new vehicles are. At number 5, we have a couple choices here. I've listed the 1973 to 78 Eldorado as well as the 1973 to 78 Toronado. Now, these are two platform mates, and that's why I grouped them together. And the 71 and 72 Toronado and Eldorado are the same body style, but they seem to be more expensive, particularly the mint condition copies. And if you have one of these vehicles, the convertibles are very expensive, but the coupes, unless they're absolutely pristine coupes, you can pick them up for relatively reasonable prices. Now, on the Eldorado front, if you buy one from 1973 to 1976, you get Cadillac's 500 cubic inch V8 underhood, which really was pretty detuned by this point, but it has tons of torque. It's very smooth. It's very, very reliable. Unlike Chevy V8s and some of the other V8s of the time period, the Pontiac V8s, well, even more of them, they don't have water pump issues. They don't have timing chain issues. The Cadillac V8s are just solid overall. And like I said, if you get one from 73 to 76, you get the 500 cubic inch V8. 77 to 8, you get the 425 cubic inch V8, which is just as reliable but not as powerful. And as an example, the 500 in 1976 was making 190 horsepower in carbureted form, and the 425 was making 180 horsepower in carbureted form, although it didn't have quite the same torque. So you're not giving up a lot with the 425, but if I had to pick, I'd get the 500. And the Toronado is similar but different. If you get a 73 to 76 Toronado, you get Ols's 455 cubic inch V8. You get a 77 or 8, and you get Ols's 403 V8. Now, the 403 is a little bit weaker, has a little bit weaker bottom end, but just don't have the engine revving above 4,000 RPMs for extended periods of time, and you're going to be just fine. And like I said, these Tornados and Eldorados, particularly if the fender extensions are gone, you can pick them up for almost nothing. The fender extensions are costly to replace. I would budget $2,000 to $3,000 to get them replaced because the replacements often don't fit right, and body shops have to fit them, then they have to paint them. But if you're just looking for something to tool around in, those vehicles really are great, and they're front-wheel drive. So if you do have to put it into service in the snow, you're going to have something that pulls through the snow amazingly well. As I said, I daily drove a 76 Eldorado for several years. I think I paid $1,500 for it, and I sold it for, I think, $1,500 3 years later. And it just was an unbelievably great car in the snow and super comfortable, very reliable, never failed to start. It was just a great, great vehicle. And yeah, the gas mileage will stink. You'll get about 14 miles per gallon, 13, 14 on the freeway, and you'll probably get about 7 or 8 around town. But you don't have to pay hardly anything for insurance, and often you don't have to pay much for the car. So the gas is what it is, but the other expenses of owning a car are relatively cheap. So that's why these make it on the number 5 list. And like I said, for whatever reason, the 73 to 78s are still pretty cheap unless they're absolutely mint-condition copies, but you wouldn't want to put one of those into service as a daily driver anyway. All right, next at number 4, we have the 1972 to 78 LTD or the 1972 to 78 Mercury Marquis. So it depends on if you want a Ford or a Mercury, really doesn't matter. They're basically the same car. The wheelbases are a little bit different. The Mercury had about 3 more inches in wheelbase over the LTD. But again, these vehicles, for whatever reason, I would say mostly if you stick to the 1974 to 8 model years, collectors really just don't necessarily want them. And you can pick them up for cheap prices, in often cases $5,000, $6,000. And they're great vehicles for that price. They're very reliable, they're very comfortable, they're well built. It really doesn't matter what engine you have, although I would say the 429s and 460s are the best. And then the 351Ms that came into play in the mid-70s, those aren't great engines. And the 351Ms, along with the 400s, sometimes tended to have lower end issues with bearings and oil pressure issues at idle. So you do want to look out for that. And some of them later had casting porosity issues. So I would say the best are the 429s and 460s, depending on the model year. Now, I didn't include the 1971 model year because the 1971s are still premium fuel V8s that need lead additive. And that's just annoying, I would say, for everyday use, that you kind of have to take care of that unless you want somebody to rebuild the heads and put hardened valve seats in. But even if they do that, unless you're changing the pistons, you're not really changing the compression ratio, you're going to have to burn premium gas. So stick with a 72 to 8, and I would even say 73 to 8. 72s have heads on them, 1 year only cylinder heads that tend to spark knock on regular fuel, at least today's regular fuel. And the 73 corrected that. Now, the 73 is a little bit down on power because of the cam timing being retarded by, I believe, 6 degrees versus the 71. But so what? The car's got plenty of power if you've got a 429 or 460 underhood. You're just not going to miss it. And again, very well built, reliable, durable vehicles that aren't going to cost you much money aside from gas. I would say with the 460s, you can expect 13 to 15 miles per gallon freeway, maybe 8 to 9 around town, something in that zip code. But overall, again, great vehicles and still a fair number of parts around because these cars were relatively plentiful back in the day. The only thing that's a little bit hard now on the four-door sedans is the windshields, but I've been able to find those. So if you can find one of these in good shape at a good price, I've in fact seen some like 76 LTDs for sale with 30,000 miles for $3,500 in great shape. I mean, how can you pass that up? It's just a great car with tons of use in it if you need a vehicle, and I think overall a great selection. Next, let's go to number 3, and that is any full-size General Motors vehicle, full-size rear-wheel drive vehicle from 1977 to 1985. Now, bear in mind that in 1985, the Olds 98 and Buick Electra transitioned to front-wheel drive along with the Cadillac DeVille and Fleetwood. But for 1985, there still were the Olds Delta 88, Buick LeSabre that were rear-wheel drive. And I say, honestly, it really doesn't matter which of these rear-wheel drive full-size General Motors cars you pick. The Chevrolet Impala or the Caprice, the Pontiac Catalina, Bonneville, the Buick LeSabre, Electra, the Olds 88, 98, doesn't matter. They're all excellent, excellent vehicles, and they're still plentiful. There's quite a few of them out there. And again, unless you've got a mint condition copy, they can be bought for relatively cheap prices. Again, $5,000, $6,000 around that mark. The mint condition ones can go for high teens, maybe even higher if they're super low mileage. But you get one with 50,000 miles that maybe has a dent or two on it, but is in good shape. And like I said, any division, doesn't matter which one, it's great. These cars were powered by Chevrolet small block engines, 350s, 305s in some cases, Oldsmobile 307s, 350s, 403s, Buick 350s in some cases, Pontiac 301s in some cases. If you get the Cadillac, you've got the Cadillac 425 up until 1979, and then in 1980 it transitioned to the Cadillac 368. You just want to stay away from, I would say, the 82 to 84 Cadillac cars with the HT40-100 engine in them. But so Cadillac, if you stick with 77 to 81, you're going to do fine. The other ones you can buy all the way up until their last model year. Great vehicles, very reliable, great riding, great handling, quiet, comfortable, reliable, bulletproof. I can't say anything more. Just ask somebody who owns one, to use the old Packard saying or a variation of it. Great cars overall. All right, let's go on to number 2. And number 2 is really, I'm going to say, the Buick LeSabres from about 1988 when the 3800 was introduced, all the way up until the end of the run for the LeSabres. And that happened in 2005. So any of these Buick LeSabres, and I'm picking the Buick in particular, while others employed the Buick 3.8 or 3800 V6, because the Pontiacs seem to be a little bit more pricey, and the Pontiac buyer drove them a little bit harder. But if you find a nice Bonneville with a Buick 3.8 engine, go right ahead and buy it. It's great. Or if you find an Oldsmobile 88 or 98 with the 3800, again, great car. I just think that in general, the Buicks tend to be babied, and they had an older clientele. So you're going to find one that's probably the most well-maintained. But anything with this GM 3800 engine is just going to be a great, reliable vehicle for you at a cheap price. I see late 90s Buick LeSabres all the time with low miles for around $5,000 or $6,000. That is a stellar buy on a car that's going to last you a couple 100,000 miles. And for anything that breaks, parts are readily available. They're super easy to service. Any mechanic can work on them, and they don't break down very often. Buick 3800 engines are just one of the best engines that General Motors ever made. And despite the fact that these cars are front-wheel drive, they really don't have problems, and they ride great. So highly recommend them if you're looking for a cheap used car. And they're kind of in that old car vein. They have a nice float to them, but they're not too floaty. They still handle well. And the great thing about these is you kind of get that old car feel. The bench seat, the spacious interior, the supple ride. And on the freeway, you'll get 30 plus miles per gallon with them. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, and it's good power. Those late 90s, early 2000s Buick LeSabres were, let's say, 0 to 60 in 7.5, 8-second cars. Now, you can get a supercharged Buick of that era, or Oldsmobile, or Pontiac Bonneville, with a little bit more power, but those did have a few more issues. They still were pretty robust. But I think just the plain old 3800 engine that's not supercharged, if you're looking for something that's reliable and cheap, get a vehicle with that. You can even go and get a Buick Regal that had the 3800. They were put in there for a number of years, and those would be reliable. Now, the only thing I will say is make sure that you get one of these true 3800 engines, 1988 and later. Before that, they weren't quite as good. The 86s and 87, 3.8 even firing V6s are not bad. The 85s and before, they had some oiling issues, weak bottom ends, so stay away from those. But the 3800s that came out in 88 and later, you're going to just love those vehicles, and I highly recommend them. And last but not least, if you want a vehicle that's got that old car ride to it and feel, but is relatively modern, what's number one? The 1992 to 2012 Ford Crown Vics and the Mercury Marquis. I could have put Lincoln Town Car on here too, but they've got a few more electronic doodads that make them a little bit less reliable. They're not bad cars, but the Crown Vic and the Marquis are just awesome. You get a 4.6-liter single overhead cam V8 in these that is absolutely reliable, beyond reproach. And they're rear-wheel drive, body on frame, quiet, smooth, supple, great trunk. They have that Ford deep well trunk that was characteristic of the Fords of the 60s and 70s. Tons of room on the inside, nice HVAC systems, nice radios, poofy seats, and really nice V8s under hood that, hey, they were good enough for police vehicles and taxi cabs for many years. And consequently, there are a ton of parts for these cars. Now, the fuel mileage isn't going to be as great as the previous cars that I suggested with the Buick 3800, but still on the freeway, you'll get 25 or so, 24, 25, and that's perfect. It's still modern, and again, absolutely reliable. So the Ford Crown Vic, Mercury Marquis, I can't say enough good about them. If you need anything to be proven about them, just like I said, look at their use as taxi cab and fleet vehicles for many years. And they're so easy to service. There's a couple little issues they had in some years with, I think, intake gasket leaks, but very, very minor in the grand scheme of things. And everything on these cars is just well built and stout. So you could pick them up for, again, $5,000-$6,000 for a really nice vehicle. And what else are you going to get for $5 or $6,000 today? So highly recommend it, especially if you're looking for a first car for a son or daughter or someone else. It's a great car for the money. It's very safe and very reliable. We'll get them from point A to point B. And, if you want to just drive one in a spirited fashion, you can have fun too. Heck, the cops did for many, many years. So hope you enjoyed this list of some fun and reliable classic vehicles that you could daily. And it's hard to believe, but some of those Crown Vics I just mentioned, 1992 to 2012, 1992 is 31 years ago now, almost 32 years ago. So they're kind of classics. And hope you enjoyed this list. Thanks again for watching.